In this video, we're going to talk about the topic of division of complex numbers. Now, what we do to divide complex numbers is really more like simplifying the number. The complex number will come to us in fraction form, and we'll do something very similar to rationalizing the denominator to be able to simplify the fraction. To start the division or simplifying process, we're going to find the complex conjugate of the denominator, and then we are going to multiply the numerator and denominator of the fraction by the conjugate of the denominator. What this does effectively is it rationalizes the denominator. Now, the rationalizing part is not necessarily very obvious because we don't literally have a square root sitting in the denominator, but we do have I, and if you'll remember, I is equal to the square root of -1. So like I said, it is basically the same thing as what happens when you do rationalizing. All right, let's take a look at an example. For this example, we're going to simplify 3 divided by just plain old I. Okay, so what would the conjugate of I be? Remember, a complex conjugate is the same value, but the negative part of the complex number will have the opposite sign. So the conjugate of I would just be -I. So we will multiply numerator and denominator by -I. Make that multiplication symbol a little bit more obvious there. So what we're going to have on top is 3 times -I, which just gives you -3I. And then on the bottom you have I times -I. That gives you -I squared, okay? Remember from multiplication, what is I squared equal to? Well, I squared is -1, okay? So -3I over -1. It's going to give you a +1 on the bottom. 2 negatives make a positive. And so you're going to get -3I over 1, which is just -3I. Don't have to do anything to that term to put it in standard form because it's just a single term of the number. It is not a real part and an imaginary part, both. All right, let's look at another one. This one a little bit more complicated. 4 divided by 2 plus I. All right, first decide on the complex conjugate of the denominator. And that's going to be 2 minus I. Multiply it times top and bottom. Don't forget, you got to do both. And be sure you change the sign on the I, okay? Because that's what makes it a conjugate of the denominator. That's what's going to make all of the imaginary numbers go away. They're going to add out to 0 or become -1. So distribute the 4 on the top. We get 4 times 2 and 4 times -I. And then on the bottom we can FOIL. 2 times 2 is 4. 2 times -I, outside terms. Inside, 2 times +I. And last, I times -I, or -I squared. So in the bottom I do have an I squared term right here. -I squared is +1. So that's going to give me a +1. Now go ahead and simplify the denominator. Put your 2 real parts together. 4 plus 1 is 5. And then what happens to these 2 imaginary parts? They add out to 0, right? So they're gone. We don't have any imaginary. We have all real on the bottom. Now to put this answer in standard form, what you need to do is split up the fraction so that you have a real part and an imaginary part. And if you've got more than one term on top and a single term, or for that matter, any number of terms on the bottom, what you can do to split a fraction is just put each term in the numerator over the denominator. So I can get away with doing this. That's going to be 8/5 minus 4, and you can do I on top or out to the side, either one. 4/5 I. And that's standard form for that problem. 8/5 minus 4/5 I. All right, let's do one more. This one's even a little bit more complicated. This time I'm going to have 1 plus I on top and then 3 plus 2I on the bottom. So take a minute and find your complex conjugate for the denominator. multiply that times the top and the bottom. You're going to need to FOIL out the top and the bottom. So on top first gives me a 3. Outer minus 2i. Inner plus 3i. And last terms, I times negative 2i give me negative 2i squared. On the bottom, 3 times 3. 3 times negative 2i. Positive 2i times 3. Oops, let's put an x instead of an I. And then multiplying those last two together, we get negative 4i squared. So with our I squared terms, on top, that's going to become just a positive 2. Remember, we're plugging a negative 1 in for I. On the bottom, that becomes a positive 4. So let's see what we've got. 3 plus 2 is 5 on top. And the negative 2i plus 3i gives me plus I. And then on the bottom, I'm going to have 9. I'll lose my 2i terms. They add out to 0. 9 plus 4 is 13. So again, we split this up so that I've got a real part plus the imaginary part. And if you want to leave I in the numerator of that fraction, you can. It's just my preference to pull it out, but it doesn't really make any difference. Be real careful in this section on your WebAssign homework, because if you've got a square root in your answers, which you probably won't have very often, but if you do, you want to be sure that you only put under the square root what's supposed to be under there. It's very easy on WebAssign to get stuck under a square root symbol and put more stuff under there than you intend to. Also be real careful with problems like this, making sure you do split those up into 2 separate terms and you do put the I where it's supposed to be.